You might recognize her for her Netflix documentary, The Great Hack. She's Brittany Kaiser, and she is going to talk today about data sovereignty. So, Brittany,
Hey everybody, how are you?
I'm sure everybody is very excited to hear you, Brittany. I'm gonna go. I'm gonna leave you alone in the stage. Thank you for joining us.
Absolutely, very happy to be here. Hi everyone, such a pleasure to be hosted by Startup Societies today, and I'm really excited to talk to you guys about what I believe is one of the most important societal, political, legal issues that we could be talking about right now, especially in a time of pandemic. So let me quickly share my screen with you guys. I wanted to talk to you guys today about a movement that I started a couple of years ago called Own Your Data. And what that really means is that we need to have a very specific set of rules that we can live by in order to know that we have control over our data, that we have control over our digital assets. Our most personal information, what our most valuable possessions are actually used for, that we have transparency, that we have control, and in a scary pandemic time like this, that we're not giving up too many of our fundamental rights and freedoms. If you guys remember, during 9/11, we were told by governments around the world that we should give up rights to our data, we should give up privacy, we should give up some of our fundamental freedoms in order to stop terrorism. Now, it's been quite a while since 9/11, and the Patriot Act is still signed into law every few years. So we didn't get back anything that we gave up during that crisis time. So I think it's really important for us to talk about what are the fundamental concepts behind data ownership, data, how does that really manifest in empowerment? And what does that look like in terms of my favorite case study of what I would say is the best data ownership or digital rights startup society? So I'll tell you guys a little bit more about that as we go along. And now, one of the main reasons that I'm talking to you guys about this is because even though you can't see it and you can't touch it, and that's why so many people like to not think about their data, they don't read terms and conditions before you decide to install a new app, even if you're giving an unknown company and an unknown person on the other side of the world access to all of your contacts, your location data, your photos and videos, data you're producing in other apps. You don't think about it because your data assets are intangible. As the world's most valuable asset class. Now think about that for a second. All of us as producers of the world's most valuable asset, somehow in most legal jurisdictions, we don't really have very many rights to that information that we are producing. And that has caused quite a lot of problems over the past few years. And if you saw my film or read my book, Targeted, then you know quite a lot about why that is so concerning to me. Now, every single year, every single moment, in fact, especially now when we're leading completely digital lives, we are producing exponentially more data than the moment before. I mean, especially exponentially more than a couple months ago. And that's why it's so important for us to take seriously into the future, because this question is not going to get easier. It's only going to become more difficult as there are more data sets about us when we're creating more digital assets, and we still do not have much control over the ones that we have already produced in the past. Now, why should we care? As I said, we have been plagued over the past many years with an increasing amount of data breaches. You can tell that companies, governments, organizations around the world have not always taken data protection and cybersecurity seriously. So you think that you've seen a lot of data breaches now. Think about the fact that everyone in the world, even if they've never been used to even using devices before, now can only live through devices. So the data breaches that we've seen in the past, well, it's the tip of the iceberg of what we should be expecting to see in the coming years. Now, I think you guys have probably seen plenty of headlines over the past 2 months about what these pandemic or crisis times actually mean in terms of the rise of the surveillance state, the lack of data rights, the lack of current concentration on the rise of privacy legislation that has been going on for the past few years. A lot of countries around the world that have only just started to implement new privacy legislation are all of a sudden putting that on the back shelf because of coronavirus. And obviously, I think everybody that works in technology, that works in healthcare, something that is going to save human life. I mean, we're all in this together. We're all trying to do something to stop the spread of the virus and to make sure that we are prepared for a future resurgence of not just this virus, but another pandemic, right? So you guys have probably read about contact tracing systems. Now there's a variety of different tools that are being used for that in different countries. But most importantly, and most essentially, it's your location data, number one. All of the information about where you are going, who you have been next to, whether you've been traveling in public or people that you visit with privately, that data is currently being used by governments and big tech companies around the world in order to make sure that if you have been in close proximity to somebody who has been positive, would be recipient of usually a government notification asking you to do a mandatory quarantine in your own home. And that might seem not too bad since we're all in quarantine right now anyway, but think about how easily that can be abused. For instance, there are some countries that are even now using their CCTV cameras, public cameras, drone technology even for facial recognition. So they can actually send someone to your home to tell you that you've strayed too far out of the neighborhood and that you need to kind of be forced to be back home. That, again, that doesn't sound so bad right now, but you can easily start to understand how easily that could be abused if a bad actor decided to take advantage of it. How we are unprotected. For the past few decades, the way that technology industries have developed are really more as a kleptocracy than anything else. All technology that we use on a daily basis has been designed to collect as much data about us as possible. And that could seem innocent if they're using our data to improve our user experience or to sell us something that we're more likely to want to buy instead of seeing an annoying ad for something you would never need. But there are a lot of technologies that we're actually using on a daily basis that are collecting data that we are not aware is being collected. We don't know where it's going, who it's going to be used by, or for what purposes. And a lot of countries right now data digital asset regulations at all, or they are updating very old laws, and perhaps maybe they've just passed some new ones. But the coronavirus pandemic has meant that a lot of compliance on new data protection regulations has been kind of put on ice, and compliance and enforcement are not going to be coming up as quickly as we hoped for. So what are the fundamental concepts that we need to be thinking about? I would say number one, transparency and opt-in. If we are the type of people that want to build a world where we value transparency, where we want people to understand what their fundamental rights and freedoms are and how to protect themselves and how to live in a free society, well, then we really need transparency. And by that, I mean, at very minimum, I should know when I pick up my phone about using it. What do certain companies want from me? What are they taking? And do I have the right to opt in or out of that if it doesn't make me comfortable? So I think it's important to talk about permission structures and traceability. Once I know what data is possibly going to be collected about me, then I should be able to give permission for certain data to continue to be collected. And if I'm going to share my digital assets with a certain company or platform, then there should be a certain level of traceability. For those of you guys here that are into distributed ledger technology in the blockchain space, then you probably think about permission structures and traceability quite a lot. How can we track and trace what data is being taken from us and where it's going? And do we have the right to stop our data from being used for purposes sent to? Now, this is another favorite part of this conversation for me, which is monetization rights. When I started the Own Your Data campaign 2 years ago, I was specifically working on what would a structure look like where if I owned all of the information that I produced, if I own all of my digital assets, then everybody that is monetizing those assets, whether it be Facebook, Google, medical researchers, then I should get a dividend of that. There is a multi-trillion-dollar industry around the world right now that has been created out of our digital assets. And somehow we're not really seeing the benefits of that, except perhaps a free login to a social media platform, a free Gmail account. I don't really think that we can say anymore that that is a fair trade. So I think it's very important to think about if we own our data, then we could use that to empower ourselves. All of that monetary value can be used for us and our families instead of only going to the platform that was built to surveil us, right? And I think it's very important for people to understand what a data ownership concept looks like, because again, when you're talking about an intangible asset class, it's very difficult to land the plane for some people. So I'd like to talk about the Airbnb model. So if your data is your property, just like your other property, and you want to lend it, lease it, license it to somebody, think about when someone wants to use your house on Airbnb. They tell you who they are, what they want to use your property for, and you agree on the length of you get paid before you hand away the keys, right? And that's really what I see as the future of data ownership. It is very much possible. I mean, how did I really get here to talk to you guys about this? I think what would really help paint a picture is to talk to you guys about one of my favorite examples of what I consider a startup society, which is the legislative framework within Wyoming, which is a very small jurisdiction. It's the smallest state by population in the US, about 500,000 people. And the legislature there are made up of some fantastic libertarians, and even the Republicans and Democrats get along and negotiate with each other and work together in a very seamless way. And they have been able to put together a legislative framework that is not like, well, wasn't like anywhere else in the world. Over the past 2 years, I've been working with the legislators in Wyoming and an incredible team of people from around the world that have flown into this tiny state to create the most complex but clear and actionable legislative framework for protecting digital assets. So I'll take you guys through what I think are some of the most important components of that. But before we get deeper into the Wyoming case study, I want to talk to you guys about the development of digital asset legislation in general. Because what are our digital assets? It's intangible personal property in some jurisdictions, but intangible data assets that or other records of information. For instance, our blockchain tokens are encrypted blocks of data, usually about transactions. So when we're trying to think about a digital asset class, for a very long time, these assets have been completely unregulated. And for those of you listening that are in the blockchain industry or have been a blockchain entrepreneur especially, you've probably come into a lot of jurisdictional questions over the past few years about where you should build your company, what assets you can actually build, what assets you can trade, what that is going to look like, because a lot of countries have not had laws governing what you are allowed to build and how you can actually grow and innovate your company and concept. So the first real kind of digital asset legislation didn't really come out until 2015. It was what I like to see as a negative piece of legislation. By negative, I mean it stifles innovation and made it very difficult for anybody working in the digital asset industry to be able to build their companies or operate. And in June 2015 in New York, they created something called the BIT license, which meant that you had to have a regulated license issued by the state in order to work in the industry. Now, there was a huge rise to create more legislation around this industry and the big, I would say, blockchain and crypto boom that started in 2017. That's when governments around the world started to think, well, this is obviously an asset class that is growing in value. The amount of companies, the amount of types of digital assets that are now being created require some sort of legislation and regulation. When it was first given the same financial safeguards as traditional assets under US law. And if you guys remember, Ledger X was granted the first federally regulated digital currency exchange license. Since then, over 32 states have proposed blockchain legislation or have passed something in regards to how digital assets are managed. Some countries have taken a friendly stance and have their arms open to bring in more blockchain innovation, people that are working in digital assets. Others have issued guidance, and others really have shifted in the opposite direction. I think we all know in this group of people that cares about startup societies and radical freedom and experimentation in these areas, it's less threatened powers that they can't control. So blockchain technology and the ability for people to empower themselves by owning their own digital assets and having full control over all of those assets was threatening to a lot of governments. I mean, over the past few years, India, China, Russia, Colombia, they have all at some point banned blockchain or cryptocurrencies altogether. We've managed to win some of them back, but it's been a really tumultuous and not always diplomatic negotiation with governments to have a real transparent conversation about what our rights are over asset classes that we cannot physically handle. So I'm going to go a little bit more into the Wyoming case study for a minute. In January 2018, I woman called Caitlin Long had just worked with legislators in the state Congress to put forth the first, what I see as positive blockchain laws. So they put a couple bills in Congress that for the first time were giving real definitions to digital assets. And these definitions were specifically made to give us a framework for ownership, control, transparency, and a set of rules that innovators in the blockchain industry specifically could live by and work by when building their companies. So Wyoming was the first place to really clarify that digital assets should be treated under commercial law, that they have commercial value and should be seen in that manner. So Wyoming defined that under the Farm Code, that there should be laws to really govern these assets as something that would often be used and traded in business. If you guys are very technical, you might think of the Uniform Commercial Code or commerce laws similar to a protocol layer. It really is the infrastructure that allows financial transactions to take place under the law, under a regulatory framework. These laws give you rules for what happens when a transaction does not go according to normal business practices or procedures. If you are the owner of those digital assets and something doesn't go according to plan, then you have rights. And the other entity that you're transacting with does have duties to you, right? Your rights that need to be respected. And what's important in the US have the full ability to control commercial laws. So the federal government would not be able to override something that was going on in Wyoming under this commercial legal framework. So what was so very exciting for me after I first started working in Wyoming was one of the first laws that was passed and went into law on March 1st of 2018 was the definition of your digital assets as your intangible personal property. So you might hear some people say that your data rights should be akin to human rights. You obviously have probably heard about the data ownership movement, something that I have been a very big part of. But there's a nuance in this conversation that shouldn't be lost, which is that if you're going to talk about control of digital assets, property rights, strongest legislative frameworks that exist in nearly any jurisdiction around the world. If you own something as your property and somebody damages your property or something doesn't go according to plan, you have very strong rights that can be enforced in a court of law. And I find that so important. As you may have noticed in a lot of the data breaches over the past few years, especially, a lot of the companies that have been involved in these data breaches are not really punished in a way that makes sense, in a way where there's any real respect of the rights of the individual whose data has been breached. And that's because until 2 years ago, nobody had data ownership rights as a property. So saying your digital assets are your intangible personal property all of a sudden ascribes property rights, something so you have that legal recourse. Also within this set of laws in Wyoming, it was the first time that super negotiability rules of commercial law were applied to virtual currencies and digital assets. That's the same rule set that basically fosters liquidity in a system. These are rules that normally apply to money. So for the first time, digital assets are being seen as an asset class that is akin to a monetary instrument, but instead it is property like a monetary instrument, but with more rights. So the ownership property model recognizes as well the true nature of how digital assets are transacted, especially on a blockchain. If you own your digital assets if you own your private keys and I am going to transfer a digital asset to another entity. I actually own the asset until I have consented to a transaction, right? So another interesting part of this legislative set was giving rights to smart contracting so that a smart contract itself could control a digital asset and govern its transactions. Another innovative part of these laws was looking at, for the first time, something called Fintech Sandbox. So this is something that I believe a lot of startup society jurisdictions should be taking advantage of, which is the ability for a sandbox to provide regulatory relief for a company that sets up in a new jurisdiction from existing laws for 3 years. So for 3 years, if you are building something that is not very well defined in law, you would to figure out what you're building and what your product and service is going to look like before you are going to have to think about all of the regulatory concerns. A lot of startups and a lot of companies that are seeking out, special economic zones or new jurisdictions to set up and grow their businesses in, really don't usually have the money to spend so much time and lawyers' invoices trying to figure out regulatory compliance, especially for something as complex as building financial technology solutions, right? So that's something very exciting that Wyoming has, both under the Secretary of State, where the sandbox not only exists to provide regulatory relief, but there's also funding to help startups explore, for instance, voting on to test out decentralized voting and different ways that we can think about when we're living a completely digital life, especially in an election year, what that could look like if we can't actually get people physically to a ballot box. So Wyoming also has a fintech sandbox within the Banking Commission, and I'll explain to you in a second a little bit more why that's so exciting. Within this legislative framework as well was the first definition of a utility token for the first time. So I think everybody here in the blockchain industry has had a lot of very serious conversations with lawyers and regulators about whether or not certain digital assets are securities, so that they're meant as an investment asset class. If you are building a lot of complex systems that require transactions and they are required in order to operate a system, then yeah, that's a utility. It's not an asset class that is meant for investment. So defining that for the first time and separating from state securities laws what utility tokens are and how they're governed was pretty exciting. A lot of other states started to follow suit after that first set of laws were passed in Wyoming. This particular part of the law was also accredited at the federal level by the US Congress for being the basis for the Federal Token Taxonomy Act. So something else that I think is incredibly important that was defined in this legislative set was for the first time defining how an individual that wasn't holding their own assets, how they could preserve their own assets by a custodian. So under the Banking Commission, for the first time, we were able to pass a law creating the first digital asset bank. So by digital asset bank, I mean an institution that just holds your digital assets, no fiat currencies, no other types of asset classes, and it allows you to feel a lot more safe as an individual, as a consumer, because they can hold your digital assets, but they have a fiduciary responsibility to you as opposed to their shareholders. So it means they have to think about your rights and what is best for you before they are trying to create profits. I think this probably could have saved quite a lot of disasters over the past decade in both the banking industry and in big tech, if that could have been better defined early on. So these new digital asset banks, and it allows you to fully own your assets. And this custodian, again, has to think about your rights before their profit. So that's pretty exciting and very cool. The next sets of laws that you guys should be looking out for that I think are really cool. I think probably a lot of people listening to this right now have dealt with or been involved with the development of DAOs, distributed autonomous organizations in Wyoming. The state is trying for the first time to see if it's possible to think about how you could regulate those structures. We don't know. It's still being debated. Also, something really cool for data rights and digital sovereignty. For the first time, we are hoping to pass a law where if open source coders are hold for what is built on top of their open source code. So it would be a safe haven for developers that wanted to come and build open source, and it would be the responsibility of anyone that built on top of their code to audit that code and make sure that there's no malicious content. So that's pretty exciting for those of you guys out there that run development shops. So to start to conclude, there's a lot of hope for the future over the coming years, but obviously since we've been in this time of crisis, I think we've really taken a few steps back in the privacy and digital asset conversation. A lot of the laws and regulations that were really exciting and looked like they were going to be very empowering for not just digital rights activists, but for all of us around the world. Those conversations are on what is going to be done to prevent the spread of coronavirus and whether we are going to give up our rights to digital assets or not. So there are international conversations that are being had about what we're going to do to balance our privacy and versus I would say control of our assets, where we have transparency into how that's used or not. There are some countries that are preferring an opt-in model, and there are other countries that are just accessing our data in order to try and stop the spread of this. So I know we're running a little bit over time, but
1 minute over time, Reed.
1 minute over time. Okay, well, I'll just conclude there to say what we're really talking about right now is the fact that we all want to see a positive digital future for everyone. We would like to have transparency and control, but that's because we want to see everybody live a better life. So I think we are going to figure out this conversation. I don't think contact tracing is going to be the be-all end-all for privacy conversations everywhere in the world, but it's something that we really need to think about, because if we want to stop the coronavirus in the future, if we want to see the development of AI and data science being able to solve a lot of the world's greatest problems, then we need to think about what are these rules and definitions that we want to live by. And I think a lot of startup jurisdictions have the opportunity to lead the way forward in that. So everybody here that is working on those jurisdictional rules, please feel free to reach out if you want any advice. You can contact me at info@ownyourdata.foundation, and you can check out my website at ownyourdata.foundation for more resources.